Say we take off, nuke the site for more, but there's only way to be sure.
Warning, the audio you are about to hear is best played at maximum volume when you and your partner are making love. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Gorilla Roundtable. With us on tonight's panel are Mike, an MBA and free market enthusiast, Nick, a PhD and political economist, and Paul, a neuroscience graduate student studying addiction and humanity in general.
On this week's episode, the jobless recovery and the race against the machine, Greece's use of odious debt, the conspiracy of the week, and the scandals and opportunity in the National Football League. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the super handsome and ultra classy gang of Gorilla Roundtable.
You guys like that? Super handsome and ultra classy?
Super handsome, absolutely.
Handsome, well, yes. Classy, questionable.
Yeah, classy. I would not go so far as to say classy. That's maybe a bit of a stretch.
So I think we got a good selection of topics this week, gentlemen, and I'm ready to get into them. Nick, I know that you are keen on the march of the robots. So would you like to talk to us about the jobless recovery and the race against the machine?
Yeah, definitely. And this is something you and I have talked about before, I think, on several occasions, right? And this is, I think one of the most significant challenges facing workers today, right? So flashback to 2008, right? Major financial crisis rolls to the United States, ripples throughout the world, right? Causes calamity in Greece, causes housing bubble to collapse in America, right? Well, in the wake of this, what happens, right? Corporate profits within a couple of years are back to their levels. But what doesn't happen, right? And what is still happening, now, 7+ years afterwards is that the employment recovery, hasn't taken place. The structural unemployment problem has only gotten worse, right? The long-term unemployed are growing. Their length of their unemployment is growing, and this is something that I think has caused some consternation, especially amongst the pundits and the policy elites. But it certainly caused a lot of pain on the proverbial Main Street of the economy. And I think you read a lot in newspaper articles or on news programs about, why this is the case. And I think one of the things that's often overlooked is this increasing replacement of human labor by automation, by machines. And I think what this has done in a lot of ways is hollowed out a big segment of the middle of the wage earning scale. Kind of menial tasks are being automated and robotized, right? So the questions I think this kind of poses, right? What does this jobless recovery force us to confront? Well, it forces us to confront this, ever-changing landscape that is the labor market, which only seems to be getting tighter and tighter. And so, the question becomes, once again, as it was still centuries ago, is technology the friend of the working man or not? While on the one hand, the microwaves and the washing machines are making the reproduction of the domestic household easier, the increasing employment of computerized technologies is putting manufacturing workers, increasingly out of work. So I think, I'd like to toss this open, I think to you first, Mike, because again, this is something that we've talked about before. What do you see happening here? I mean, what does the increasing use of precision robots and precision technology mean for laborers, for workers?
And it's a good question. It's a very good question. I just want to point out that it's robots are the almost the foil here. They're the cast as the villain when the real situation here ought to include globalization, because to the worker and from the worker's perspective, there is no difference between having your job taken over by an automaton or having it sent overseas. I think that globalization does play a part in that. If anything, globalization keeps the human element in that march towards a robotized workforce. Globalization almost mitigates that progress. Were it not for globalization and the ability to send work overseas to other people, you would have a faster a more expedient rush towards automation. That being said, I think the state of the worker, at least domestically and more likely globally, workers are just not competing against each other anymore. They're competing literally against machines. And in some aspects, you can beat the machine, and in some aspects, you cannot beat the machine. And for unskilled and rote labor, there's no way you're going to beat a robot. It doesn't take sick days. It doesn't do any of that stuff. You find yourself saying, well, what's going to happen to the American worker? What's going to happen to labor organization? What's going to happen this, that, and the other thing? And I would say to you that labor organizations are a relic. I mean, they're becoming more and more an answer without a question.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And because it's interesting, so I think, Paul, that's kind of what I wanted to toss to you, right, is, what are workers going to do? I mean, do we see a revival of, kind of the Luddites, right? Do we go, and smash up the machines, right? What do you, how do workers and labor organizations, right? We've already heard Mike thinks, that they're kind of relics, but, how can workers and workers organizations respond to this increasing use of technology? The big T.
The big T, as it were, right? We're not talking about public transportation in Boston either. I study science, of course, and I'm a proponent of technology. And what I really think will come out of this is, instead of maybe the dissolution of labor unions or workers' unions, I think what's going to happen, and what you'll see happening, is just pure adaptation and education for workers in terms of adapting to these different circumstances that technology produces. Now, the idea is, when people are educated, when they're young, they generally don't have, if they only persist in that education and they don't adapt to different types of technologies, they're not going to be able to be prepared for any technologies that are going to be there down the road 20 or 30 years in the future. So what you have is a situation where you have to constantly be updating your education, and I think it's a responsibility of the labor organizations and the people in charge of those organizations, and of course, maybe more so than that, it's the responsibility of the people producing the technology and the companies that are profiting off the technology to provide that education. For example, what we've seen is, say you're a printer of telephone books, right? Your job is pretty much obsolete at this point. People still drop off telephone books on my front doorstep, but I put them right in the recycling bin. I think they're pretty much useless. Now, for example, right, so if you're working for a telecommunications company where that's your job, it's the onus of the company itself to say, all right, here's what, if you want to still be a productive member of this type of industry, here's what you're going to have to do to adapt. Or here's the opportunities that I'm going to provide for you to be able to adapt in a way that doesn't leave you unemployed and that doesn't affect your livelihood in any significant fashion.
Well, I was just sort of curious, to kind of throw that back to Mike, because, right, I mean, so, let's say labor organizations, they're, as you say, they're relics. But we have this increasing problem of, structural unemployment, very much like Europe, with huge percentages of, our young people and, especially, minority young people being unemployed or even unemployable, given the kind of overabundance of labor per job opening. Do we need to overhaul the kind of unemployment insurance system? I mean, what's the way to help workers in an economy where there's just vastly less call for laborers? I mean, are there some sort of Malthusian checks that you see necessary, maybe?
I think that in all reality, the labor unions today are concentrating on the wrong market. Okay, the labor unions ought to be concentrating on apprenticeships and getting folks enrolled in trades. Because the one thing that you cannot automate at this moment is wiring a house for electricity. You cannot automate the plumbing welding and the plumbing work that is done in my individual house. Now, that's not a systemic answer that if we got everybody to become a plumber or an electrician, it's going to solve unemployment. However, there are huge chunks of the population in those two underserved, and that's just two off the top of my head, those are two underserved career paths.
Sure.
You have on one hand, you have two underserved career paths with a demand for labor. On the other hand, you have a lot of unemployed people who have labor to give, a supply of labor, and for some reason the labor unions ought to be the link that gets those two together, and they're not doing that. And I feel like education, skills, apprenticeships, those are the things labor unions need to worry about. They need to change their model up. It's not the 70s anymore, and it's surely not the 30s.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Well, it's true, although, I do think leave it to me to defend unions, but I think there's still a lot of value in that older style of mass mobilization of workers. I guess the worry, though, right, is, again, at least for me, part of this is that, with this increasing use of machines, we end up concentrating labor on either these kind of fairly low-end kinds of professions, right? There's only so many toilets that need to be unclogged, right? But we end up with I worry about whether or not this sort of hollows out the meaning of the traditional middle class in America. Those manufacturing jobs that pay you somewhere, in and around the median income. I don't know, unless maybe, I don't know how we get plumbers and electricians up to making, 50, 55 grand a year. But, I don't know how we do that.
Well, plumbers and electricians already make very good money. A new electrician in a union starting out probably makes $50,000 or $60,000 a year. If you are an electrician or a plumber and you have a few years of experience under your belt, you can routinely make six figures. And one of the reasons those salaries are so high is because they are underserved with labor. You literally have to pay that much because there's so few people you can select from to do your plumbing or electrical work. So,
in terms of the automated menial tasks that machines are replacing, that Nick is referring to here, I truly believe that technology is constantly progressing towards a state in which it's better. We're better off, in general. The middle class is better off for not having to perform those tasks. I don't think the onus is on the unions to educate workers to be able to adapt to these new economies.
So I can tell you one thing that labor unions do, and that is provide apprenticeships at zero cost. It's essentially the cost of your union dues, and you would pay those anyway. Now, you can come out of an apprenticeship with zero debt, whereas you go to college and you come out with a ton of debt. That's accurate to say, right? So that's one of the things that labor unions do very well. Speaking of debt, I kind of want to talk about Greece and their testing of the odious debt concept.
Good, yeah, this is great. I'm glad we get to follow up on our conversation from last week.
Yeah, well, we're all aware of the situation in Greece, the election of
Syriza. They won. Woohoo! Go Syriza.
Old boy's name is Sisporus, though, the god of the left. So his election has caused some major heartburn in the Eurozone. Some
serious hand-wringing and eyebrow furrowing going on over there.
Greece has become a Russian sanctions veto. It's painted Germany as the ruler of the EU in some of its verbiage. The German position is that the Greece internal political struggles shouldn't burden the rest of the EU, and they've pointed to Greece pivoting towards Russia. But one of the things is that adds fuel to this growing toxic fire is the Greek pursuance of declaring their debt as odious. Now, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with what odious debt is, so let me give you a brief definition here. Essentially, odious debt is like if a tyrant or a despot takes over my country, and then they incur a whole bunch of debt. When they are deposed, the idea is that debt does not belong to the country, it does not belong to the people, it belongs to that specific regime. Not the folks, but the state the representatives of the state that incurred it. So I find this extremely interesting that Greece would go down this route, and it makes me wonder, can a legitimately elected body ever borrow in an odious fashion? So I'd like to ask Paul if he wants to start out. Paul, what do you think about that?
Well, in terms of the definition of odious debt that I'm somewhat familiar with, I think it could be, somewhat philosophically here, I think it could be more general, right? So I think essentially odious debt comes down to debt that whatever's in the national interest of most of the people, right? The majority of the populace, or maybe as a populist perspective, if they don't support, the debt that went into creating different programs for the government, then that should be defined as odious debt, right? So in that context, depending on how the elections occur in a particular country, I think a legitimately elected body, could borrow in an odious fashion, but I think for most purposes in a democratic election, no, because that definition that I just gave, that's relatively, I think, loose, right? And so, in this case with Greece, I think it's going to be complicated because it seems like Kamenos believes that I think Germany is one of the major creditors, I think, for Greece now, as you pointed out, and so Kamenos thinks that the debt should be written down, but from what I was reading, Tsipras was a little bit more conciliatory recently in his tone. He kind of wants to, I think, try to be a little bit more democratic and retain supporters throughout Greece and maybe even throughout Europe to try to make this a larger movement.
So, Nick, what's your take on this? Can a legitimately elected body ever borrow in an odious fashion? Is Greece right in their yearn for sovereignty here and to kind of pull the decision-making ability away from Germany?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I guess to me, what it really, I guess as a classical philosopher, right, it depends on the meaning of legitimately, right? And I think, if you set a high enough bar for the legitimacy of democratic elections, the answer is no. But then again, when you look around and you look at history and you look at the real world, most of the countries that test this odious debt concept, it's almost never the case that it's a legitimately elected government, right? And so the case that jumps to mind immediately is not Greece, but Argentina, right? Who have tested the odious debt concept as well, with their massive debt that was acquired under their last military regime. So I think it's interesting because I think what Greece can say, the way that Greece is going to present this debt as odious is by saying, well, look, the Troika, the EU, the ECB, the IMF, they strong-armed us into taking on all this extra debt as part of the bailout, and then all the money went basically back to German and probably some French banks that were overexposed to Greek debt, and so very little of that money made it into Greece itself for any kind of economic stimulus, right, which has, only kept Greece in this kind of, recessionary spiral. So, I don't necessarily know how good of a chance Greece has at being successful, but I do think that there is some legitimate ground for saying this debt is odious. Again, if they can show, which I'm very, I don't say certain, but I bet they can, that the Troika of the IMF, EU, and ECB, applied some strong-arm tactics to Greece to get them to accept this loan package that might not have been the best for them.
So let me ask you this, Nick. Let's say Greece is successful in pushing this through, right? And their debt gets wiped away, odious debt, everybody kind of agrees. Do you see this as setting a dangerous precedent to favor established order? So now you have an institution who can refuse to lend to any given. Instead of having to be above board and at arm's length with all transactions, they may refuse to lend to certain regions who aren't who are not politically favorable to them, and then come back and say, well, that's there's questions of legitimacy and we don't want any odious debt. So there's almost a moral hazard question that comes up, and it's in favor of the well-capitalized countries where the banks reside.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think so let's just imagine a hypothetical world where, international law is a lot more robust and a lot more reliable, and this odious debt concept is a sufficient part of it. It's a very strong part of it. What I think this means is that, international capital, international, bankers are going to have to do a lot more due diligence about, what regimes they get into bed with, and I think this has, to me, a lot of promise, because you have a lot of poor countries around the world that are rich in resources, and dictators. And these dictators thrive by getting loans from Wall Street, by getting loans from first world countries. And I think if it were easier for these countries to discharge those debts, to, write them off, hopefully international capitalists at least would be more reluctant to finance some of these dictators and, basically bankroll the kind of bloodshed and mayhem that they often perpetrate. So I see potential positive benefits here to some chastening of international finance.
So let me ask you the same question, Paul. Does that present an opportunity for the Western nations to call what would be a legitimate government, legitimately elected government, to call them illegitimate, and to Nick's point, not to lend to them for fear that they now have a increased ability to declare odious debt?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a fear. And I mean, it's unclear. As Nick pointed out, the robustness of international law is a question here, right? And so we're in the hypothetical circumstance where, the claims of odious debt by new regimes are actually carried out and are actually enforced. I think that would be a fear for these first world countries, but I think in the long term, it's maybe in a lot of cases unpredictable for the first world countries, such that they will continue to lend to these countries that satisfy their short-term economic interests. and they can capitalize on their own wealth, I think, in the short term, such that it might not be a concern for them, at least now. Now, I think another concern that might come out of this is the other European nations, right, that are poor, that might be considered second world nations, or that are Eastern European nations that might come back to Germany and say, well, hey, you let Greece off the hook here, what about us? So I think that's also a concern that Germany and the other wealthy countries of Europe might have to deal with, the creditors.
No, that's very interesting, absolutely. Foreign policy and international banking is a high-stake game, and sovereigns have plenty of tools to get what they want. Things like, stage suicide. And now it's time for the conspiracy of the week.
There's a conspiracy out there. You know what I'm saying? There's a conspiracy. A C-O-N-spiracy.
Well, Mike, let me tell you, we came up with a good one this week. I found this one and I was really happy with it. So let me kind of lay the groundwork for the intrigue that is this story. So, flashback. It's 1994. There is, the deadliest terror attack in Argentine history, it's the bombing of a Jewish community center. 85 people were dead, and again, like I said, worst attack in the history of that country. Turns out, Iran is implicated in this attack. So, of course, investigations are begun, right, as any country would after an attack. There are all kinds of investigations to get to the bottom of it. So, flash forward, 2015, right, it's now January 18th, and Alberto Nisman, the lead prosecutor in this investigation of Iran for these attacks, is found dead in his apartment with a single gunshot wound to the head in a, quote, apparent suicide. Well, what makes this suspicious, even more so than that he's the lead prosecutor, is that this happened one day before Mr. Nisman was to testify before a congressional hearing about this case. Even more incendiary is the fact that he was allegedly, in giving his testimony, going to accuse the sitting president of Argentina, Cristina Kirchner, of shielding various Iranian officials who were involved in the cover-up. And basically, what people are claiming is that she covered up their involvement as part of a quid pro quo involving a sort of grain for oil trade between Iran and Argentina. And so, out of this bubbling cauldron of intrigue, right, emerges the claim that, actually it was, Kirchner who came out and said that, of course, she believes Nisman was murdered. The claim, though, is that it was Kirchner herself who had Nisman murdered so that she could have this political theater moment wherein she gets to allege that this murder is actually an attack on her.
Is this another false flag?
Potentially. I mean, this is right. So this is kind of why I was thinking about this one this week, was that, we have this kind of interesting parallel where here's another claim of a false flag, that this is actually... now, again, the investigation in this matter hasn't been resolved. It's still ongoing, so there isn't a lot of clear evidence, although, of course, as you might expect, suspicion has been cast upon an aide to the late Mr. Nisman.
I have to say, in these situations, I always find it insane that it always is like the day before there's someone's going to actually testify or something like that. No one disappears like 3 weeks before, a month before, or whatever. It's always like the night before or the morning of. Right,
which teaches us an important lesson. Criminals are procrastinators.
Yeah, that's very true. That's absolutely true.
So the president also is, so you keep referring to her as Kirchner, and I've also seen in the press, maybe a little bit more frequently, Fernandez de Kirchner. So just in case people so Fernandez de Kirchner. So I'll also point out a couple facts that I came across regarding this case, right? And so right now it's unclear what happened, but the apparent thing that happened was a suicide, right? And so there's traces of DNA found in the pistol, its ammunition. The forensic experts say that undoubtedly matched Nisman and no one else at this point. So there's a security camera in Nisman's apartment that was not functioning. However, people are saying the reason that there's so much speculation is that people who knew Nisman said, this couldn't have been a suicide. There was not this situation occurring. Also, Nisman was constantly afraid for his safety. He was even skeptical of his own federal police guards. There were 10 federal police that were assigned to protect him. as this case was going on, and he didn't know who to trust. And he actually, this person that Nick was referring to, Nisman kind of confided in, and his name is Diego Marcino. He's an IT specialist at Nisman's office for years, right? And so he actually lent Nisman this gun that ended up that killed him. That forensic experts are saying was the gun that was shot by Nisman that killed Nisman, of course. And so this guy Diego Marcino, I might be pronouncing his name wrong, but essentially the articles I've read, it seems as though he's claiming that he's quite innocent in this regard. However, what's strange is that President Fernandez de Kirchner, has essentially pointed the finger at him and pointed the finger at many other groups as well, that he was responsible for this. People have claimed, the Argentinian newspapers claimed he's a spy, the intelligence secretariat Antonio Stiuso as well. Also, other people have been blamed, the Mossad, Iranian groups, so it's really unclear. But what I think is so strange is that if truly Lago Maristino was involved, and if he truly is a spy, we probably would know nothing about him in this context. And also, it's strange to me that Fernandez would kind of preempt the investigation with these incendiary remarks. And what do you guys think about that?
Well, every time I go back, every time that this happens, like I say, it's either the day before or whatever, the security camera tape comes up missing. And I don't understand, every time this happens, all of those things happen to come together in a way that, leaves questions wide open.
So Nick, what do you think happened in this situation? If you were to guess, based on the evidence that's available to you, what do you think actually occurred?
I think that's it's a question I don't think I could legitimately hope to answer. I mean, I think you were right to point out this guy had a bevy of enemies, right? There are plenty of people who, and the Iranians are one of them, who don't want to see this investigation go any further. And of course, if Kirchner, if Argentina is engaging in this grain for oil trade with Iran, and, because of this cover-up, then of course the Argentine government would have, some reason also to want Mr. Nisman dead, or at least to want him to not talk about this cover-up and this, economic quid pro quo. But I find it very suspicious, especially given the timing of it, and, especially given, sort of kind of the larger difficulties Argentina is going through. I mean, I think that's the kind of conspiracy questions that people come up with about this story, right? Is this just a kind of political stunt by Kirchner, right? Did she have him killed to, create a furor about this? A, it silences him, but B, it distracts people from, some of the other, economic issues going on in Argentina right now.
What about the other option of this being an act of a martyr who's trying to play a trump card? Whereas old boy did commit suicide, and I keep wanting to call him Les Nessman. I don't know why that's bouncing around my head, but let's say he did commit suicide and he disconnected his camera and he timed it just right for the maximum political effect against his opponent. It would be the ultimate trump card against, as he saw it, against whoever the villain is here, against Kirchner.
Yeah, well, that would certainly be one highly elaborate act of revenge.
Hey, it's a conspiracy.
That's right.
It's a conspiracy of the week.
That's right.
Right, yeah. I mean, it's so strange, though, even if that's the case, it's so strange that Kirchner would go out of her way to make these comments. And I'm not suggesting that it wasn't a suicide. This guy was getting threatened, maybe his family was getting threatened. So, Nick, as you pointed out, this occurred on January 18th, fairly recently. Well, there's another unsavory event that actually happened January 18th that I want to talk about in our next segment. And this thing that happened on January 18th involves an American organization, and that's also had its share of cover-ups recently. It's the National Football League, the NFL, of course, as we're all familiar with. The event that I'm referring to is called Deflategate, and so essentially this is only kind of the most recent in a series of not only cheating scandals, but other scandals involving domestic violence, other events that have occurred involving public health in the NFL and football on a larger scale. And so I'll talk about Deflategate just for a second. So essentially, Deflategate, what happened was the New England Patriots are alleged, when they played the Indianapolis Colts on January 18th, to have used purposely deflated footballs during the AFC Championship game. Now, the advantage there is that what happens during the NFL is that back in 2006, there was a change made to the rules where teams on offense were able to use their own footballs, right? And so the footballs, there's very strict rules to how much air they can have in them. Generally, it's the rule is between 12.5 and 13.5 psi. But during this game in particular, there's an interception by the Colts in the first half. Whoever intercepted it said, wow, this ball feels a little bit underinflated. And so in halftime, they investigated. The balls were actually about 11.5 psi, which is not that much, but either way, when you underinflate the footballs, especially in cold weather, it makes them easier to throw, makes them easier to catch, right? So many advantages that you could have on offense, right? And so not only this, there's evidence that the Patriots have actually been doing this since 2006, right? And so this is, of course, more problematic if it's been a long-standing thing. And so I'm not going to talk about, whether or not the Patriots did or didn't do this. Of course, they're still denying it, and the investigation's ongoing. But back in 2007, there was another gate scandal that occurred with the Patriots. It's called Spygate. And what this involved is the Patriots videotaping defensive signals illegally, and in particular the New York Jets. And so they were videotaping signals on the sidelines and then using them in subsequent games. Bill Belichick, the coach of the Patriots, claimed that he thought he could do this, when in reality the rules prevented this. So Belichick himself was fined $500,000. The team was fined $250,000. Let's continue. If we're not talking about the Patriots, back in 2011, another scandal called Bountygate was brought to light. Bountygate essentially involved bounties paid to defensive players for them injuring people. So what do you think about that, guys? So you injure someone, you take them out of the game, then you get paid a bounty of $1,000. How's that sound?
Well, as an incentive, that's a good incentive,
but not very ethical, you might say.
No,
so yeah, generally,
I definitely wouldn't say.
I got to say, I find it very interesting that anyone would feel the need to record the New York Jets before the game and use that against them.
Right. Well, it wasn't just happening to the Jets. I think it also happened to the Buffalo Bills and to some other, I think the Chargers, some other AFC organizations that the Patriots normally, compete against. I think the Dolphins as well. But yeah, either way, with this Bountygate, this was happening with the New Orleans Saints, particularly involving a defensive coordinator named Greg Williams. Initially he denied it, but then he later revealed the scheme in its entirety and apologized. And of course there were penalties that were paid out. Oh yeah, in some cases I read up to $8,000 would be given as a bounty for so-called kill shots to injure players, take them out of games, right? So that's what's one of the other scandals going on recently that has come to light. Most notably, more recently, what we have is domestic violence cases going on in the NFL. And according to a USA Today article in 2014, out of 713 arrests of NFL players since the year 2000, 85 of those were due to domestic violence. And most notably recently, I think some female senators have called out against this. Greg Hardy was convicted of assaulting an ex-girlfriend, but he was not disciplined by his team. He was not disciplined by the NFL, and he continued to play. And so there's one final thing in terms of public health that the NFL is covering up lately, and this is head trauma. Essentially, of course, we know football is a rough sport, and particularly football is involved in head-to-head collisions that the NFL has tried to reduce recently, but perhaps not enough. What's been happening is that NFL players are dying in their 40s and 50s. A few have committed suicide recently. There's been one instance of a homicide followed by a suicide where upon autopsy, what is shown of these football players' brains is what's called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, right? And so when this happens with multiple concussions or head injuries, it's a progressive neurodegenerative disease. There was a book and a documentary in 2013 that described this phenomenon where the NFL knew about this, right? And they knew about the scientific advice that had been given by doctors, but they kind of covered it up because they were worried that it would affect the integrity of football and whether or not moms would let their children play football, of course. So this documentary is called League of Denial. Exposed the fact that the NFL was covering up the severity of the head injuries sustained. So what that's resulted in is a class action lawsuit that's continuing today with thousands of former NFL players. And so I wanted to ask you guys, looking at all these scandals that are going on in the NFL, and these are just perhaps a few of the more recent ones, I wanted to ask you, Mike, is the NFL more of kind of a soap opera than other sports? I mean, why do we tolerate these scandals in the NFL? Are they even, in some cases, does the media perpetuate them to attract fans, to keep fans and players? What do you think?
And that's an interesting question. My first hunch is to go, well, the stat that you gave about the 85 out of 713 arrests, that's about 12%. So how does that stack up against the general population?
Right.
It may in fact be better as a percentage, but I don't have the stats to speak to that. But to me, I would like to know the answer to that. I think it is an open question. And so to the point of whether the scandals are tolerated, and are they, somehow subtly encouraged in order to attract and keep fans, I think, and I can't remember the old boy's name, but, he gets fined for doing a crotch grab end zone dance. The point being, there's a fine. They fine him. That's bad behavior. This is a punitive action. You are fined. I mean, that's what we understand a fine to be.
Right.
However, I also read that if you go to the NFL website, you can buy pictures of this moment that were taken by, NFL photographers. So on one hand, they're fining this guy for violating rules and so on and so forth in a punitive way to understandably create a disincentive of that kind of behavior. But on the other side, they are selling to the crowds pictures of this guy doing that. And that is the craziest thing that I've ever heard of, because that is exactly what you're talking about. I mean, it's hard to say you're being punitive in a fashion to try to incentivize proper and specific behavior if on the other side of that you're using that event to make some money.
It's commission thuggery.
Well, I mean, it's hard to, right, me, I, as a complete outsider in terms of football, I couldn't care less. So, I absolutely don't understand why people continue to put up with the terrible bad behavior from football players and, continue to pour money into the NFL. I mean, you can't decry what the NFL does, but, continue to pour money in their pockets. I mean, it cuts against each other. Whether it's more of a soap opera, I don't know. I think sports is, it's kind of what appeals to sports, is that it is a soap opera, right? But I think with football, it does seem like, a lot of that happens off the field increasingly.
To that point, though, if it happens off the field, then is it fair to point to the organization that employs that gentleman as the culprit here? I mean, if I did a statistical analysis of Walmart workers and found that there was increased domestic violence among the folks who work at Walmart, is it fair to point to Walmart as the culprit?
Right, that's a good point.
Well, we depend on a scrupulous and rigorous, investigation. I mean, we wouldn't dismiss it outright or embrace it outright before, understanding what the claim is and how it might be true.
Yeah, no, right. And I think we're in agreement here. I think the point I'm trying to make is that the organization that employs this gentleman is not the organization that makes decisions about his behavior. Now, in some cases, to Paul's point, is that distinction that clear? Is there a strict delineation between employer and off-field decision making? And I think Paul's contention is there may not be that clear delineation.
Right, I think that's true. Yeah, I mean, because these suspensions and these fines are they kind of seem just to fuel the behavior more than anything else. I mean, it's not like this is ending anytime soon, it seems. But yeah, I do agree with your point, though, about Walmart in the sense that, it's not like the organization itself is condoning this, but it seems like for the NFL at least, the culture does condone this. I mean, it's at its base, it's a culture of violence, and it's a culture of perpetuated violence.
It seems to me that, I think you're both right. I mean, it's not, the NFL is a business. It's not then their business is not being the morality police of their workers. That's definitely right. I mean, to me, what I think the NFL is definitely culpable of, and seriously so, is the other thing Paul mentioned, which is the head injuries. I mean, I think that's a legitimate kind of public health issue, and I think that's where some serious attention should be displayed. I mean, I think football players can help do good work in spreading a message of, how uncool it is to do domestic abuse and all that. But, ultimately, I think, is that their job? No. It's great that they do it, but ultimately, their job is to play football. And I think, as workers in an industry that puts their bodies, in which their bodies are the product, they deserve some protection.
Right.
They are unionized. I mean, there is a players union, so they are represented. Now, how that works as far as the some of the negotiation and whatnot. I think there's a very strong players union. One of the things that I think is up for debate is whether or not one of the ideas has been to remove the helmets completely, and the idea behind that being that a lot of the folks who are doing the tackling are doing so in a more aggressive fashion because they have a helmet on, whereas if they did not have a helmet on, they may be a little bit more self-aware about their body positioning, their speed, etc., and that would reduce the number of head traumas. Now, I haven't seen any facts on that one way or the other, but I have heard that floated.
Well, look at like rugby, for example. I mean, I don't know the numbers, but we would want to know, right? What is the rate of CTE amongst rugby players?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
The story broke about football, and so most of the research has been into football players. And I don't know how much this has been explored in other sports like rugby or hockey, for example.
There was one player, Barry Taylor. He's an Australian rugby union player. He died in 2013 of complications of CTE, dementia, at age 77, right? So he played for 19 years. At least as far as this article goes, this is one player, right, who dies at an age that surpasses many NFL players who generally will die in their 40s and 50s, right? So you have the circumstance where, NFL players by and large are living, 1, 2, maybe even 3 decades shorter than the average life expectancy. And that's a general thing that occurs, right? So it seems like, a very cursory look suggests that, maybe the data isn't there for these other sports like rugby or like hockey, or maybe even soccer. In some cases you can have some pretty severe head-to-head injuries. And I also read in this, when I was researching this topic, is that, even it doesn't have to be repeated injuries that result in CTE. Soldiers that have a single significant blast event can be diagnosed with CTE as well. So, single concussions that are severe enough could result in this.
If there is opportunity for the NFL to act as an entity here, if their actions as an entity are having such a widespread effect, that tells me that they have some kind of sway and some kind of strength. So is there not the opportunity here for them to turn some of this to get better policy and better social outcomes?
Yeah, I think definitely, because I think if anyone's going to, they do have a ton of power, and if anyone's going to try to change the policies, it should be them. But of course, we can't just allow the NFL, or we can't just settle for a situation in which the NFL softens what data is out there just so that, for the perception of maintaining the business, as Nick was pointing out. Because, of course, it's problematic because, on the one hand, the NFL wants to retain not only NFL players but also NFL fans, and wants to, of course, continue to recruit what would be NFL players from youth leagues and such like that. But I think the NFL is in a unique position to change the views of the public on this overall. And so I think, Mike, you came across a couple commercials, right, that suggested that there might be at least organizations that might be trying to bring to the attention at least the domestic violence issues that are going on.
Yeah, so really there's 2 commercials that I found that I think are relevant, and I guess my point with this is that the NFL, outside of the football and the scandals and all of that, just as a entity that exists, virtue of its existence, it provides avenues for other organizations to have their voices heard. We know that the Super Bowl ad time comes at the cost of very big dollars. One of the organizations that has taken up arms to produce a Super Bowl ad is an organization called No More. Nick, you'll remember we talked about it with Clem. Mm-hmm. Celebrities were lending their voices to No More, which is a domestic violence ad. So I found 2 ads, one for domestic violence and one about parenting that I'll play next. But let me play this PSA, this domestic violence PSA, and then we can kind of chat about it. Let me just kind of preface it here. It starts with the telephone ringing, and it's just shots of a house, some of the kind of an empty house. There's no people in it, but it's obviously furnished. Some of the rooms are in disarray.
911, operator 901. Where's the emergency?
127 Brynmere.
Okay, what's going on there?
I'd like to order a pizza for delivery.
Ma'am, you've reached 911. This is an emergency line.
Large with half pepperoni, half mushroom.
You've called 911. This is an emergency line.
Do you know how long it'll be?
Okay, ma'am. Is everything okay over there? Do you have an emergency or not?
Yes.
And you're unable to talk because...
Right.
Is there someone in the room with you? Just say yes or no.
Yes.
Okay, it looks like I have an officer about a mile from your location. Are there any weapons in your house?
No.
Can you stay on the phone with me?
No. See you soon. Thank you.
You know, and then a little bit of verbiage comes up at the end about why it's important and blah, blah, blah. My point with this is really hits home. And this is going to play during the NFL's big game, its biggest game of the year. This is going to be a commercial that people see. So that's a great opportunity for this organization and this topic and this subject to get its voice out there and start some debate.
I think it's good that it will bring the debate into a context that is outside of football. I mean, the discussion we should be having about domestic violence isn't about, why it's more prevalent in football or, why can't the NFL do more to stop it? The issue of domestic violence isn't about football. It's about, the thousands and the millions of other, non-football players who are abusing their domestic partners.
Exactly.
Nope, that's absolutely right. Absolutely
but
right.
It's definitely a good venue to get these ideas out there and potentially to change cultural thinking patterns. I mean, I think it's unfortunate that it has to come to that, where we need to use these large events that people tune into to get this message out. It should be that the data speak for themselves, and that the ethical education that we've all received should speak for itself. But of course, that's unfortunately a little bit too rosy. But yeah, I think it's certainly a good step.
And the other ad, guys, that I thought was really good was this 2015 Real Strength ad. And now it's actually by Dove, the people who make Dove chocolate and Dove soap. You might remember them for their Real Beauty campaign. I don't know. Do you guys remember the Real Beauty campaign?
I don't know.
No, I don't
have cable TV, so I don't.
Well, that was they was in magazines, and it was a pretty big campaign. It was probably 2005 or 2006, if I recall. They had a bunch of quote unquote real women as opposed to unreal women, which I guess is a supermodel modeling lingerie. They had real women modeling lingerie, so they were much bigger than the standard women.
Yeah.
And that was, quote, the Real Beauty campaign. So they have come out with another campaign called the Real Strength, and it's aimed at men as opposed to women. So let me play this one, and let me set this one up. This is essentially it's a bunch of snippets of kids playing with their dads.
Daddy?
These kids are doing stuff that kids do with their fathers.
Is it really worth playing then?
Well, I just want to give you an idea. So I can kind of cut it off here, but to your point, it's kids playing with their dads, and they're going through the different things that dads do with kids, tickle them and play in the pool, and they show a husband and wife, I'm assuming a man and a woman with a sonogram picture, and the guy's calling up his dad. So this one hit me pretty close to home as a father. I was very happy to see this because the character of fathers in media, as I see it, is a bumbling idiot. He's falling off the ladder. He's spraying himself in the face with the paint can, and this is a first that I think more accurately represents the role of the father. The idea of how this ties in to what we were just talking about, a lot of it is surrounded with ideas of masculinity, and Nick and I have talked about this on previous shows. The concepts of masculinity drive a lot of our social change and drive a lot of our culture. So this is Dove taking a stab, albeit for commercial purposes, at defining that masculinity in a way that is more noble than it has been in recent media. So I'm just curious what you guys think of that. And
well, I don't know if it necessarily signals a change, in regard to the NFL or anything like that. But I think it's just something fresh that they haven't tried before. Maybe, I don't know, just some new corporate agenda for them to try.
Yeah, I probably feel somewhat similarly. I think we would all agree that there is a cultural trope in which the father is the Homer Simpson character, and there's certainly a virtue to a more humanistic portrayal of a father character. But what any individual advertisement can do to change social norms is unclear.
To my point, essentially, this is again somebody trying to leverage the popularity of the NFL. You know, in the bigger scheme of this, you have this Dove ad that came out, a Nissan ad came out that was very pro-father. You had a anti-domestic abuse ad that came out. So each of those, in its way, is speaking to masculinity, and it's almost as if, and I bet if you watch the Super Bowl, it's not going to be a masculinity definition festival as far as the commercials, but there is a theme in some of the commercials. And I just find that interesting that that's been the theme of 2015. I mean, that seems to be more than one company in varying industries are trying to hit at this specific demographic.
It does seem to me, I mean, like Paul said, somewhat cynical. I mean, you know, these things only come out because of the, you know, abysmal, let's call it, record for the NFL over the last, you know, 8 or 9 months. And so it does seem to me, you know, a kind of cynical way for companies that advertise with the NFL who don't want to be tarnished by the NFL's problems to seemingly engage in this conversation about masculinity and redefine it in a more appropriate way. But again, I'm kind of with Paul that, you know, I just don't see this as anything more than kind of a marketing ploy by people.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Paul. I am Mike. This has been Gorilla Roundtable.